Like a cockroach, Jack Harkness, or Supernatural, the hope that Lance could be the Black Paladin just refuses to die. But what are the actual chances that this will be canon?
Whoosh. It's us.
After the Season 5 trailer, hope for seeing Lance as the pilot of the Black Lion is stronger than ever. So we're going to be taking an in-depth look at Lance's character arc, Shiro's character arc, and the story as a whole to see what we think his chances are. Before we talk about those points though, let's take a look at why people think he could be the Black Paladin, should be the Black Paladin, and what evidence they bring to the table to support the theory. Most of the evidence seems to center around the fact that in the wake of Shiro's departure, Keith's departure, and whatever it is that's going on with Shiro currently, Lance is emerging as a leader on the team. And as we all know, the Black Paladin is a leader whose men will follow without question, or something like that. Here, I'd like to point out that a good leader does not equal a good Black Paladin. After all, if that was the case, Allura would have been the Black Paladin in Shiro's absence, not Keith. Lance being a good strategist is also used as evidence to support the theory. Those are the two main canon traits of Lance's that people bring to the table as for why he's got a shot. Here are a few other things I've read that are usually held up as for why Lance might be Black Paladin. These are just recurring themes that I noticed, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. Number 1. Lance hasn't had a character arc, which means that he's being set up for a huge character arc that will involve him becoming the Black Paladin. This is based on a flawed premise, which I'll be talking about momentarily. Number 2. Shiro is destined to either die or become a teacher/mentor, also a flawed premise, which I'll also talk about. Number 3. Lance being the first to connect with his line was meant to show the audience that Lance is a character of special significance, and that the omission of the Blue Lion's traits was meant to conceal the traits of Lance's that make him special. With that last point in mind, let's talk about why people want Lance to be Black Paladin. Lance is, for lack of a better term, the fandom darling, and with that comes the emergence of a trend I've seen before: fan works and theories that deliberately mischaracterize other characters to make the fandom darling seem more sympathetic. I've seen this in a lot of different fandoms, and weirdly enough, it's usually a character that's very similar to Lance, someone with a lot of surface bluster who's secretly insecure and/or damaged. Or just named Tony. For characters like Loki, Sherlock Holmes, Tony Stark, Spencer Reed, or Jim Kirk, fandom likes to play up their damaged side, often turning these individuals into punching bags for the other characters. The other side of this phenomena is when a fairly average person, the everyman, like Lance or say Tony DiNozzo, is made out to be a secret genius or secretly the best fighter or the most beautiful or just generally the best in one way or the other. This is so prevalent in Voltron that there's a term for it: Langst. To be clear, I don't inherently hate Langst. When I watched the first season of Voltron, Lance was my favorite character, and I'm always gonna love him. My problem with Langst is that it's almost always based in completely fanon interpretations of both the show and the characters, and that people often expect to see the show follow their decidedly out-of-character, Langsty headcanons. To be clear though, just because something isn't going to become canon doesn't mean you can't have fun with the concept. For my part, I have a lot of fun with the concept of Altair and Shiro, and I've even laid out a few canonical reasons why I feel it has a slight chance of happening in the show. But at the end of the day, I can accept that it being confirmed in canon has nothing to do with whether or not I can let my imagination run wild with the concept. Okay, let's get back to the subject. As the everyman character, Lance does have a special significance. He's the character that the audience is supposed to relate to the most, and props to the writers for pulling that off so well. However, there is a drawback to Lance being average. It somehow makes him not good enough as he is. A significant portion of the fan works I've seen about him usually having him turn out to be an Altean prince, the Black Paladin, or some kind of secret genius. To sum up, people often give Lance traits that canonically belong to someone else. Altean Lance is usually just ginger-bent Allura, and Black Paladin Lance is what I call looks like Lance but is actually Shiro. Maybe this guy isn't a clone, maybe the real clone was the fanon Lance we created along the way. Now that we've established the thought process behind why this theory exists, let's take a closer look at those three things I mentioned earlier: Lance's character arc, Shiro's character arc, and the story overall. First, Lance's character arc. As mentioned earlier, the premise that Lance hasn't had a character arc is very flawed. His character arc began the second he was on screen. Something I love about the first scene with the Garrison Trio is how it immediately establishes all three characters in such a short amount of time. Number 1, Hunk is scared and nauseous, but still trying to hold it together and do his job. Number 2, Pidge is smart and sassy and seems to be the one who knows best, but she isn't going to assert herself. Number 3, Lance is arrogant and doesn't seem to have a good grasp of what his skill set actually is. It should also be noted here that Lance's decisions are the kind that we see from Keith. For Lance, emulating Keith leads to failure. This is important to remember going forward. Together, the three of them are a terrible team because they're firmly in the grip of their most negative qualities. The next scene immediately shows a different side of Lance, his insecurity. These two scenes combined effectively tell us what kind of person he is. That is also where his character arc begins. And just because we haven't seen the resolution to it doesn't mean that it's non-existent. In the book Superstructure by James Scott Bell, he discusses the 14 beats that the emotional structure of a story should hit. For Lance, I'm going to talk about 2, the third and the last. The third beat is what Bell refers to as the argument against transformation. He states that this is often where the theme of a story is introduced and where we discover what it is that our character needs to learn in order to reach the last beat, transformation. For Voltron, and specifically for Lance, that theme is the importance of teamwork. Lance is someone who is very insecure and acts very egotistical to cover it up. His ego often stands in the way of the team, especially in the first season. If we take, say, Lance interrupting Allura as his argument against transformation, then we now know what his transformation arc will be about: humility and being a team player. I covered this in my recent video about Voltron and the theme of sacrifice. What Lance is learning to sacrifice is his pride. I mentioned Lance's insecurity earlier, which is something a lot of people hold up as evidence for why he should be Black Paladin. The reasoning here is that being the head of Voltron is the most important place on the team, and that if Lance were the most important person on the team, then that would be the validation that he's been seeking. Which is an incredibly flawed line of thinking. Let's break it down. Assumption number 1 is that the Black Lion is the most important lion, that being the Black Paladin is akin to being the chosen one, or that being able to pilot her is like being able to pull the sword from the stone. And that's not supported in the show at all. Like any other lion, the main requirement for being Black Paladin is that your quintessence is compatible with the Black Lion's. That's it, really. Which comes down to more than just being a good leader. Also, if we elevate the Black Lion to being the most important, by default we're saying that the other lions are less important. Voltron can only exist with all 5 lions. They were equally important, they just served different functions. Black is the most powerful, but red is the most agile, while blue is the most adaptable. Remember, it was the blue lion that was able to navigate on Thacerix, not the others. Assumption number 2 is that if Lance were to be Black Paladin, that he'd overcome his insecurity and finally feel like he belonged on the team, because he accomplished something exceptional. Which is downright yikes, because it implies that the only way you can be a Paladin of Voltron is if you're exceptional in some way, whereas Lance's existence proves the exact opposite. Having a Lance on the team proves to the audience that Voltron doesn't go around choosing Paladins based on how strong, smart, tough, or exceptional they are, but rather based on the content of their character. Lance was the very first person chosen. Think about it. The person that the audience relates to the most, the one that's supposed to be our stand-in, is the one who becomes a Paladin first. And nothing in the story, except for his own insecurity, ever suggests that he doesn't belong there. Also, the in-universe impact that Lance has as a Paladin shouldn't be sold short either. Out of all of the Paladins, he's the one that connects the easiest with new people, no matter where they're from and what they look like. So we've established that being Black Paladin doesn't serve as character arc, but how does being Red Paladin or Blue Paladin actually serve it? If Lance isn't promoted to head of the class, how can he ever know his own self-worth? Easy. I've actually covered this in previous videos. Here's an excerpt from our video, Is the Lion Switch Permanent? Part 3. Ever since Lance has been introduced, he's been Keith's shadow. The only reason he was promoted was because Keith dropped out. The only reason Lance is in the Red Lion is because Keith is now the Black Paladin. I don't think that this is meant to show that Lance has become a better pilot than he used to be, although he has. Look at those moves. Rather, I think that this illustrates that Lance is still being put in a place where he's constantly the spare Keith. Him taking back the mantle of Blue Paladin wouldn't be a step back for him, because it would be a sign of him owning himself as his own person. Not Keith 2.0, just Lance, the one and only. And from our Voltron and the Theme of Sacrifice video, one arc that is slowly and beautifully developing is Lance's. While the audience is told why each character was chosen for their lion, Lance rudely and rather arrogantly interrupts Allura before she can tell us what the traits of the Blue Paladin are. This means that the qualities that make Lance the Blue Paladin are being revealed via exposition. Show, don't tell exposition. One thing that Lance is slowly learning is what Iroh told Zuko in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. True humility is the only antidote to shame. Lance's insecurities come from a feeling of shame because he has created in his mind what he believes he needs to be to finally achieve the adoration and praise he has been seeking. But he is learning now what it means to be the Blue Paladin: humility and selflessness. Lance must sacrifice his own ego for the good of himself and for the good of his friends. Simply put, I believe that Lance's desire to be Black Paladin springs from his desire to be better than Keith. The reason why he wants to be better than Keith is because he is jealous of him and feels like he needs the best Keith to receive Shiro's praise. For Lance, wanting to be Black Paladin is rooted in his need for personal glory, and not necessarily because he wants to be the leader. To put it another way, he doesn't want to be the leader because he has an abundance of ideas about how the war should be fought. Rather, he sees the leader as the one who gets the most praise and attention, and that's why he wants it. Shiro, Allura, and Keith all make good leaders because they have very personal connections to the Galra. At this point in the story, Lance does not. Also, it's worthwhile to point out that Lance isn't becoming a leader so much as he's becoming an advocate for the people around him, including those who actually lead. For Shiro and Allura, being a leader has a lot of symbolism attached to it. They inspire, they bring hope, they rally armies around them. But Lance isn't like that, and I don't think he ever will be. Remember, Lance is the everyman character. When he leads, it's going to be quieter and almost in a background sort of way. Remember when Keith rushed in blindly on Thacerix? Who stepped in and took care of the other paladins? Who reminded Allura of her power in Season 4, Episode 6? Who gracefully put aside his own wishes and encouraged Keith to pilot the Black Lion in Season 3? The end of Lance's character arc, his transformation, will be him realizing that he's just fine the way he is and that he isn't a stand-in for anyone else. Now let's move on to Shiro's character arc. For Lance to be Black Paladin, that means that Shiro would have to step down. So would it serve Shiro's arc to no longer pilot the Black Lion? Short answer, no. Slightly longer answer, Shiro no longer being Black Paladin would actually be a confirmation of his worst fears and a huge step backward in his arc. In Crystal Venom, we see that his worst fear is that he isn't worthy of being a paladin. Taking the Black Lion from him and permanently giving it to someone else would implicitly confirm that. I've heard it argued that someone else should pilot Black because Shiro is tired and needs a break. But this line of reasoning completely ignores that Shiro loves being the Black Paladin and that for him it actually is what's best. Because every version of Shiro in past shows was always a minor character, there seems to be this pervasive assumption that VLD Shiro is also a minor character who's destined to die or simply fade into the background at some point. Which is hilarious because his entire character arc is about survival against all odds and never giving up no matter what. Shiro as a character is about prevailing in the face of the impossible, about defeating enemies that are bigger, stronger, and better armed than you. Shiro is inspiring not just because he defeats his literal foes in battle, but because every time he pilots Black, it's a victory against his PTSD. Now that we've looked at Lance and Shiro, let's talk about the overarching story. Here, I'm going to get a little bit more speculative. When the last 2 episodes of Season 2 rolled around, I thought, they're getting really close to defeating Zarkon. Why is the story moving so fast? Then Shiro retrieved the Black Bayard, and Voltron became the most powerful we'd yet to see it. And then they got clotheslined. Since the end of Season 2, Voltron itself has suffered quite a few major setbacks. Although they've recovered pretty well from all the obstacles they've encountered since that moment, I still believe that that was when Voltron was most powerful, and that we won't see Voltron that powerful again until we have the original Paladin lineup once more, with all of the original Paladins back in their right lions. Now that I've gone into great detail about Lance, Shiro, and the overall story, let's talk about my last point. What would it take for it to make sense for Lance to be the Black Paladin? In all of the other points that I just raised, where could we find the evidence to support the Lance as Black Paladin theory? Full disclaimer, these next couple of theories are very speculative. So how do I think Black Paladin Lance would happen? Let's go back to Season 2, Episode 1, when Keith pilots Black for the first time. In this instance, the only reason Keith wants to pilot the Black Lion is to save Shiro. In Season 3, Keith pilots Black because he feels that that is what Shiro would want. Both times that Keith initially pilots the Black Lion, it's for Shiro. Ergo, if Lance were to pilot Black, he would have to put aside any desire for personal glory and instead would have to do it for Shiro's sake specifically. And if we go back to the first episode, there's actually evidence for Lance doing just that. Something that I've always thought was strange was how Shiro's color is purple. I mean, I get that the Black Lion needs another color to go along with it so that it stands out in space, but why purple? Well, purple is a mixture of red and blue, and if we take a look at Lance, Keith, and Shiro, we can quickly put a few comparisons together. Keith is an excellent pilot and hand-to-hand fighter who has a bit of a temper and refuses to give up no matter what. Lance is compassionate and often empowers others and reminds them of who they are and what they are capable of, and, as I stated earlier, one of the things he's best at is connecting with others. Basically, if Shiro were a coin, Lance and Keith would be the 2 sides. Now let's go back to the first episode and take a look at the very first time that the 3 of them interact with one another. Keith's introduction into the show is him saving Shiro, something that he does over and over again. Usually it's from some kind of physical threat. So if Lance is the other side of the coin, he's likely destined to save Shiro as well, but from a different kind of danger. If we combine Shiro's fear of not being good enough to be a paladin with Lance's tendency to step in and remind his friends of who they are and what they are capable of, then something we stand a good chance of seeing at some point is Shiro experiencing a crisis moment where he feels he is no longer meant to be a paladin, and Lance, as someone who is intimately familiar with that feeling, will step in and remind him that Shiro is worthy of being a paladin. In conclusion, my personal hypothesis is that Lance will pilot Black in a situation where he is giving it back to Shiro, but that's just my 2 cents. So what do you think? Be sure to let us know in the comments if you haven't already.